It was a quiet March evening in 1965 when the Higgins family disappeared. Their stone cottage sat at the edge of a sleepy English village, its chimney usually puffing smoke, its garden gate always creaking in the wind. That night, neighbors recalled, the air felt unusually heavy, like a storm pressing down on the earth. Yet the skies were clear. By dawn, the family was gone. Plates of half-eaten bread and eggs still sat on the table, butter melting into puddles. A radio in the parlor crackled with static, hissing like a restless presence. Upstairs, beds were unmade, children's toys scattered as though play had been cut short. Nothing suggested a struggle, yet everything spoke of interruption, as if life itself had paused mid-breath. Only the family dog remained. It was found trembling at the bottom of the stairwell, its eyes fixed upward, its howls raw and unceasing. Police officers later admitted they could not calm the animal. It kept its gaze locked on the shadowed landing, refusing to climb higher. The cottage itself began to change almost immediately. Within days, villagers swore its walls darkened, the plaster flaking as though decades of decay had settled overnight. The windows, once bright, grew opaque with a film no amount of cleaning could remove. Even the garden soil soured. Flowers withered, and the grass refused to grow. It was as if the house recoiled from memory, erasing any trace of warmth. Those who lived nearby claimed they heard strange sounds in the nights that followed. Faint hymns drifting from the empty cottage, low voices murmuring behind locked doors, children's cries that carried across fields. Yet each time the police investigated, they found nothing but silence. The Higgins family did not just vanish. They were erased. To understand the disappearance of the Higgins family in 1965, we must leave behind the English countryside and look across the Atlantic to a past America does not wish to remember. Beneath its rolling farmlands and church steeples lies a soil rich with ghosts, a soil that has absorbed more than crops, more than rain. It has absorbed silence. Between 1800 and 1950, the United States was dotted with orphanages, missionary schools, and remote seminaries. These institutions were presented as sanctuaries of faith, places where abandoned children were clothed, fed, and raised under the discipline of God. The truth was far darker. Behind locked doors, discipline became cruelty. Records were manipulated, names erased, entire generations lost in paper-thin gaps between census reports. Some children grew into adulthood. Many never did. The Higgins family's ancestors, Irish immigrants who had fled famine, settled in Massachusetts during this same period. They worked as caretakers in one such orphanage, never realizing that the walls around them held rituals older than the country itself. What began as whisper hymns at midnight became something unrecorded, something spoken of only in fragments and half-remembered testimonies. Historians who have studied these institutions speak carefully, as though afraid to say too much. They describe diary pages torn from ledgers, photographs with faces scratched out, letters that end mid-sentence. Communities remembered children who once played in the yard, then pretended never to notice when those same children were gone. It was not just the poor or abandoned who disappeared. Sometimes entire families were swallowed, erased from records as though they had never existed. The Higgins family, nearly a century later, would inherit the silence. Their disappearance in England was not an isolated event. It was a continuation, an echo of a hidden American past bleeding into the present. In 1851, on the outskirts of a quiet Massachusetts town, stood the Ashford Orphanage. From the outside, it looked like a blessing, a brick building with tall windows, surrounded by farmland and pines. It was funded by wealthy benefactors and endorsed by the church. Townsfolk spoke proudly of it, telling outsiders that Ashford children were raised in the light of God, but those who lived closer knew better. At night, the chapel bell tolled at unusual hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes just before dawn. Villagers swore they saw pale figures, children in white gowns, filing silently into the chapel long after they should have been asleep. By morning, those same children walked the grounds hollow-eyed, their lips moving in whispers too faint to catch. The matron of the orphanage, Margaret Vale, was a stern widow who claimed divine visions guided her methods. In her private journal, later recovered half-burned, she wrote unsettling entries. Asterisk, the children speak words I cannot write. The smaller ones resist, but the older accept the silence more quickly. Asterisk, another passage simply reads, asterisk, their mouths move though no sound emerges, yet I hear them in my sleep. Asterisk, local farmers often reported seeing lone children wander in the fields at night, their faces blank, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. When approached, the figures dissolved into the tree-line. Dogs refused to go near them. Horses bucked at the sight. By 1870, the orphanage no longer stood. It burned to the ground one winter's night. The fire raged so hot that villagers could not approach until dawn. When the ashes cooled, authorities found no bodies. Not one child remained inside, though dozens had slept their hours before. The official explanation was a tragic accident, but townspeople whispered another story, that the fire had been set from within, not by the staff, but by the children themselves. What happened at Ashford was not unique. Across 19th century America, institutions that claimed to save children were built upon a philosophy more insidious than poverty or hunger. It was a doctrine disguised as faith, a doctrine of erasure. The reasoning was simple and cruel. Children were to be stripped of their past, their languages, their identities. Silence was purity. Obedience was survival. The orphans who resisted were punished until they no longer resisted at all. For some, that meant years of indoctrination. For others, it meant vanishing. Paperwork became the weapon. Inspectors noted missing names, blank spaces where children should have been recorded. Sometimes an entire page was removed from the ledger, the edges too clean to be accidental. In photographs, faces blurred or were crudely scratched out, leaving behind eyeless silhouettes. And in cemeteries, rows of unmarked mounds told a truth no priest would ever confess aloud. The church bells still rang every Sunday, drawing townsfolk into pews, their voices rising in hymns. Yet not one of them asked where the children had gone. Silence became communal, and denial itself became worship. It was safer not to question, safer to pretend the doctrine was holy rather than monstrous. Ashford was one of many. From Kansas to Ohio, from Alabama to New York, seminaries and orphanages shared the same methods, the same midnight rituals, the same missing records. The fire that consumed Ashford did not end its legacy. It scattered it into whispers, into bloodlines, into families who had carried the infection of silence with them. The Higgins family, whose ancestors once walked Ashford's halls, could not escape this inheritance. Though they would eventually leave America, the doctrine followed. It clung like a shadow, a sickness that waited patiently across generations, until one night in 1965, when it came to collect. When the Higgins family fled famine-stricken Ireland in 1848, they arrived in Massachusetts desperate, broken, and poor. Work was scarce, but the Ashford orphanage needed caretakers, those willing to scrub floors, mend beds, and keep the endless wheels of discipline turning. The Higgins line began there, in a building already heavy with secrets. Generations later, when their descendants returned to England, they thought they had escaped. They bought cottages, built lives, raised children. Yet the mark of Ashford lingered. Families who lived too long beside silence began to echo it. Stories passed down at Higgins' hearth always stopped short of resolution. Lullabies ended on unfinished notes. Grace at the dinner table trailed off into muttered fragments. To outsiders, these habits seemed like quirks. To those within, They were chains. Whispers in the Higgins bloodline suggested things best left unsaid. A great-grandmother who prayed with her hands over her ears. A child who refused to speak until the age of 8. Then sang only hymns no one else recognized. A father who burned an entire chest of family letters, declaring, asterisk, some word should never survive. Asterisk, the trauma was never acknowledged. It was inherited, not as memory, but as atmosphere, a heaviness passed from parent to child. Silence became discipline. Discipline became survival. And survival meant carrying a history too dangerous to name. By the time the Higgins family in 1965 settled into their English cottage, they were already burdened with generations of unfinished prayers and suppressed screams. What appeared to neighbors as a normal family was, in truth, the final link in a chain stretching back to Ashford's midnight chapel. The doctrine had not forgotten them, and when silence claims its own, it does not forgive distance or time or oceans. It always returns. The Higgins family's cottage sat on a quiet English lane, a small stone home that looked older than its years. It was the kind of place that seemed to breathe, a house where every creak in the floorboards felt deliberate, where shadows lingered too long in the corners. Neighbors often said the Higginses kept to themselves, but no one thought much of it. After all, families value privacy. Privacy was ordinary. Yet inside that cottage, nothing was ordinary. Visitors described the pressure in the air, as though the walls themselves inhaled their breath. The fireplace gave off heat, but no warmth. Even in summer, the rooms felt cold, and when the wind cut through the hedgerows at night, the sound that rose from the house was not the whistle of drafts, but something closer to voices, layered distant, as if whispered through stone. Neighbors noticed strange patterns. Candlelight flickered in the upstairs windows long after the family had gone to bed. Curtains never fully opened during the day. The Higgins children, once playful in the garden, grew pale and watchful, retreating indoors before dusk. Some villagers claimed they heard them singing at night, soft hymns that carried across the fields. But when they drew nearer, the songs faltered into silence. Then came the last night. A farmer walking home swore he heard children crying inside the cottage. Not just English cries, but layered voices, some too old, some too young, some in tongues he did not recognize. He did not enter. By morning, the family was gone. When police broke inside days later, they found claw-like scratches running up the banister, a hymn book left open on the parlor table. Its title read, "Deliver Them Unto Silence." The Higginses were not missing. They had been claimed. When investigators tried to trace the Higgins family line, they found themselves staring into voids where history should have been. Parish books in England listed births and marriages, yet whole branches of the tree ended abruptly, as though clipped away by unseen hands. In Massachusetts, where the family's ancestors had once lived, the gaps were even more troubling. Entire decades of records were absent. Baptism dates faded into smudges, death certificates missing from county archives, children's names listed one year and then never again. What should have been a simple genealogy unraveled into a labyrinth of silence. It was as though someone, generation after generation, had been deliberately erasing them. Among the surviving documents, patterns emerged. In one family Bible, a string of names had been crossed out, each with an ink blot large enough to stain through the paper. In another, margins were filled with strange symbols. Circles intersected with crosses, spirals etched over and over again, as though someone's hand could not stop repeating them. Even more chilling were sketches that appeared in orphanage ledgers tied to Ashford, small children kneeling with mouths sewn shut. No one could explain why the drawings were there, or who had made them. The surviving fragments pointed to a truth investigators dared not print. The Higgins family was not simply unlucky, nor were they victims of poor record-keeping. They had been cataloged and erased by a system older than memory, a system that recorded not lives, but offerings. By 1965, that system had crossed the sea with them. The open hymn book left in their home, the claw marks, the cries in unfamiliar tongues, all echoed what the ledgers already told. The Higgins bloodline was not lost to history. It was marked by it. Of all the details surrounding the Higgins disappearance, one stands out above the rest. The sound of singing. On the night they vanished, multiple villagers swore they heard voices rising from the cottage. Some described it as a hymn sung in harmony, delicate and reverent, the kind of music one might expect in a cathedral rather than a private home. Others insisted it was darker, a dirge, heavy and guttural, the kind of sound that shivered the bones rather than lifted the spirit. Yet what united every witness was this. The music had no source. No record player was found in the home. No neighbors were awake to sing. The radio discovered in the parlor was broken, its dial stuck between stations, producing only static. And yet, as people later recalled, the sound was not faint. It filled the air around the cottage, carrying over hedges and fields, echoing off stone walls. It seemed to seep from the house itself, as though the walls had learned to sing. Some villagers likened it to the stories they'd heard about Ashford Orphanage, the midnight processions, the hymns whispered in voices too many to count. Survivors of other institutions spoke of the same phenomenon. Music that bled through locked doors, hymns sung by those long dead. When investigators entered the cottage days later, they noticed one disturbing detail. The open hymn book on the parlor table was worn, its pages smudged with fingerprints not belonging to the family. On the margin of the song "Deliver Them Unto Silence" was a faint scrawl, barely visible under the lamplight. Asterisk. When they sing, follow them. Asterisk. The Higgins family did. And like the orphans before them, they followed the choir that wasn't there, into a silence from which no voice returns. The disappearance of the Higgins family might have been dismissed as an isolated tragedy, a bizarre footnote in England's troubled history. If not for the unsettling reality, it wasn't unique. As researchers dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling thread woven across the Atlantic. From 1830 to 1950, dozens of similar vanishings were recorded in rural America. Families gone overnight, homes left in perfect order, meals uneaten, candles burned down to their bases. And always, the neighbors reported the same detail. Strange music. In 1874, a farming community in Pennsylvania, whisper of a family, called the Whitakers, last seen kneeling in their barn for evening prayer. By morning, the barn was empty, their shoes still neatly placed by the door. A hymn book was discovered, open to song about deliverance, its pages blackened as though burned from within. In 1901, a settlement in Kentucky reported voices echoing through the hollows, an otherworldly choir that seemed to come from nowhere. The Harper family vanished that night. Their home was found abandoned, but on the wall above the hearth, someone had carved the words, asterisk when they sing, follow, asterisk. Even in the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, families in Oklahoma were said to have disappeared after neighbors swore they heard church music rolling across the plains. What unsettled investigators most was not just a repetition, but the timing. Each disappearance coincided with moments of local despair, harvest failures, epidemics, financial ruin, as though the music came only when people were most desperate to believe in salvation. The Higgins were not the first to vanish into song. They were only the last in a long line of families across 2 continents who stepped willingly or helplessly into silence. By the mid-20th century, whispers of the singing vanishing had settled into folklore, dismissed by officials as nothing more than rural hysteria. But within certain circles, among archivists, theologians, and a handful of journalists, the stories clung like cobwebs that refused to be brushed away. In towns where disappearances had occurred, families passed down quiet warnings. Children were told never to answer a song they couldn't see the source of. Farmers refused to work their fields after sundown if they heard faint hymns on the wind. Churches, instead of offering comfort, became places of suspicion. Could the very houses of God be conduits for something ancient, something that had worn a mask of faith for centuries? The deeper one looks, the more troubling the pattern becomes. Disappearances were rarely random. They struck families known for piety, obedience, and trust in divine order. The kind of people who would not question a voice that called itself holy. The kind who believed salvation came in surrender. This is where fear began to root itself, not in the vanishings themselves, but in the idea that faith could be weaponized. That belief could be twisted into a trap. A family praying by lamplight, a mother soothing her child with hymn, a father kneeling at his bedside, all could, at the wrong moment, become vulnerable to something that demanded their devotion in ways they never imagined. Even today, in certain archives sealed away in forgotten seminaries, you can find fragments of old letters and journals that speak in hushed tones of singing nights and gatherings that were not meant for human ears. They are never cataloged, never referenced in public records, yet they remain preserved, perhaps because those who kept them understood the danger of forgetting. Publicly, the church dismissed the stories as superstition, fragments of rural imagination born from poverty and fear. Clergy warned against feeding hysteria and insisted that tales of families swallowed by hymns were nothing more than satanic rumor. And yet behind the stone walls of diocesan offices, records tell a different story. Confidential memoranda from the late 19th century reveal bishops exchanging anxious letters about disturbances in parish communities. One priest in Ohio admitted to hearing phantom choirs outside his rectory and begged for reassignment. Another in Virginia warned that parishioners were being drawn away by a false liturgy, sung in a tongue older than Christ. These letters were marked ad internum, for internal eyes only, and filed under restricted classification. The denials were not born from disbelief, but from fear contagion. If the faithful were told that even prayer, even song, could open a door to something unspeakable, what power would a church retain? So the disappearances recovered were named or blamed on earthly causes, wandering vagrants, criminal activity, madness within the family, anything but the truth. But the facade cracked when priests themselves began to vanish. In 1923, Father Declan O'Rourke of St. Mary's Seminary disappeared after reporting that the hymns had begun following him into his dreams. In 1939, an entire convent in New England shuttered overnight after sisters complained of nocturnal choirs circling their cloisters. The silence surrounding these events was deafening. Official bulletins recorded closures as financial struggles or consolidation of parishes, but those who lived near the sites knew otherwise. They still remember the nights when windows rattled with voices too many to count, rising in crescendos that ended only when the building stood empty. The church denied, but the music did not stop. If the church's denials created a wall of silence, the orphanages cracked it open. These institutions, scattered across America, were places where the most vulnerable lived. Children abandoned, displaced, or taken from families deemed unfit. It was here, in the dormitories and chapels of these facilities, that the music seemed to thrive. In 1912, an orphanage outside St. Louis reported that entire wards of children awoke at the same time of night, humming melodies they swore they had never learned. Staff insisted the songs were nothing more than dreams. Yet when investigators asked the children to sing, they all produced the same tune, a hymn written in no known language, its notes arranged in a pattern eerily similar to the chants of medieval monastic orders. A decade later, in New York, 2 surviving wards from the abandoned St. Florian's Asylum testified that the music began not outside, but within the walls. They described hearing footsteps in the attic, followed by a chorus that grew louder until it seemed the building itself was breathing. One boy remembered holding his hands over his ears, only to feel the vibrations in his bones. Another girl swore the matron herself had been led away by the voices, never to return. Records of these testimonies remain fragmented, many labeled as delusions or mass hysteria. But the consistency of detail is impossible to ignore. The children spoke of a lightless procession, figures moving to the orphanage at night, singing as though the world beyond the walls did not exist. Some of those children lived long enough to write letters as adults, their words desperate and unsteady. Again and again, they warned the same thing. Asterisk, the songs follow you. They grow inside you. You cannot outlive them. Asterisk, hidden deep within the vaulted libraries of seminaries and forgotten university basements lies a collection almost no one is permitted to see. Archivists call it a choral file, a body of documents that, if made public, would shatter the fragile wall of denial the church and state have maintained for over a century. The archive is said to contain field reports from priests who broke ranks, scribbled journals of nuns who heard the phantom masses, and confiscated letters from orphanage staff who witnessed children being carried off by something they could not name. Every page is marked by urgency, by terror, and by the sense that something vast and unseen was unfolding beneath the guise of faith. Perhaps the most disturbing artifact is a collection of wax cylinder recordings dated 1896, stored in cracked cardboard boxes. They were supposedly captured in rural Missouri by a traveling Jesuit who believed he was documenting folk hymns. But when played, the recordings reveal overlapping voices, layered in impossible harmonics, producing tones far beyond human capacity. Listeners describe nausea, hallucinations, and in some cases, waking dreams of corridors lined with kneeling figures. After 2 archivists died under unexplained circumstances in the 1940s, the cylinders were sealed away, their location classified. Even more haunting are the fragments of sheet music filed under anomalous canticles. The notes themselves follow no earthly scale, yet choir masters who glimpsed them claim they could be sung. Though do so would invite something listening back. Access to the choral file is strictly limited. Requests vanish into bureaucracy. Those who press further are quietly redirected, their careers dismantled. Still, whispers circulate that the archive is not just a record of what happened. It is a manual, a guide opening the very door that swallowed the Higgins, the Whitakers, the Harpers, and perhaps countless more we will never know. For every family that disappeared without a trace, there were the rare exceptions, the ones left behind, survivors. But to call them that is misleading. They did not escape whole. They emerged broken, altered, as though marked by something that had brushed against them in the dark. One such survivor was a boy from Kansas, age 9, whose parents and 3 sisters vanished in 1927. He was found wandering barefoot along a country road at dawn, whispering fragments of hymn in a language no one recognized. When questioned, he said only, asterisk, they followed the light, but it wasn't the sun. Asterisk, he spent the rest of his life in and out of sanatoriums, never speaking of his family again. In Maine, 1938, a woman named Clara Kinslow was discovered alone in her farmhouse after neighbors reported hearing a midnight service from her property. Her husband and children were gone. When asked what happened, Clara insisted they had been called into procession, but that she had resisted. Doctors noted deep bruising around her ears, as if she had clawed herself in a desperate attempt to block the sound. She lived in silence until her death, refusing even to hum. Patterns emerged in these fractured accounts. Survivors often displayed heightened sensitivity to sound, startled by the faintest echoes. Many claimed to hear music in running water, in wind through the trees, even in the buzz of electrical wires. Most carried the same haunting conviction, that their loved ones were not dead, but still singing somewhere, trapped in a chorus that never ended. The scars were not only psychological. Several survivors bore physical changes, unnatural hearing ranges, strange harmonic speech, or rhythmic spasms in their breathing, as though their bodies were involuntarily keeping time with some hidden cadence. They lived, yes, but they did not return. Officially, nothing happened. No families vanished into song. No orphanages emptied overnight. No priest disappeared after reporting choirs that should not exist. That was a line carefully repeated by both church and state. But silence itself can be an indictment. Newspapers that once dared to print stories of the vanishings quickly retracted them. Editors received quiet visits from men in black coats, representing interests of national stability. Whole print runs were destroyed. Reporters who persisted found their careers dissolved, their reputations smeared as peddlers of hysteria. Government records from the 1930s reveal a more troubling truth. Declassified memos from the Federal Bureau of Investigation include references to auditory contagion phenomena in rural communities. These files, stamped restricted circulation, detail surveillance of churches and orphanages where singing was reported. Agents were instructed to collect evidence, then suppress it. To this day, whole sections of these documents remain blacked out. Why the silence? Perhaps because both church and state understood that the phenomenon, whatever it was, thrived on attention. Perhaps because acknowledging it would unravel faith in institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. Or perhaps, more chillingly, because authorities themselves were complicit, using the vanishings to eliminate communities seen as weak, poor, or expendable. Residents who lived near afflicted sites recall armed men guarding abandoned churches, preventing entry for months before the buildings were razed to the ground. They recall government trucks hauling away sealed crates in the dead of night, marked with nothing but a cross and a number. The official record tells us nothing, but the silence, the absolute refusal to speak, tells us everything. It suggests that what swallowed the Higgins, the Whitakers, the Harpers, and so many others was not a secret unknown to power. It was a secret they chose to bury. Though the vanishings were largely forgotten by mid-century, the echoes have not ceased. In fact, in subtle, unsettling ways, they have adapted to the modern age. In 1962, a ham radio operator in Virginia reported intercepting faint choral music on a frequency reserved for military communication. The recording, analyzed decades later, contained harmonic structures nearly identical to the anomalous canticles hidden in the forbidden archive. The operator vanished a year later, leaving his radio equipment still tuned to the same frequency, as if waiting for another broadcast. By the late 20th century, the phenomenon appeared to shift into the realm of technology. Several reports describe families who vanished after installing new radio sets or phonographs. In 1981, a Kentucky man claimed that his child's toy keyboard began producing hymns he had never heard before, always at night, always in perfect, multi-voice harmony. Within weeks, the family was gone, their house found unlocked and silent. Even more disturbing are the accounts from the digital era. In the early 2000s, a handful of audio engineers noted corrupted files circulating online, short bursts of distorted music embedded in otherwise normal recordings. When slowed down, these fragments revealed choirs chanting phrases in archaic dialects. 2 engineers reportedly suffered seizures after prolonged exposure. And today, scattered across online forums and late-night broadcasts, whispers persist of the procession, a phrase survivors once used, now repurposed to describe strange auditory incidents. Listeners claim to hear phantom choirs in white noise, in static, in the hum of fluorescent lights. It is as though the voices have followed us, shifting from wood and stone into wires and circuits. The old hymns are not fading. They are evolving, waiting, moving closer to every ear that dares to listen. By the early 21st century, isolated incidents had begun to coalesce into something far more alarming. Reports of synchronized events. Entire neighborhoods claimed to hear the same phantom hymn on the same night, though no radios or speakers were active. Witnesses describe the sound as not external but internal, resonating in the skull, vibrating in the chest, leaving behind a hollow ache when it ceased. In 2008, residents of a small town in Iowa woke at 3:11 a.m. to what they described as a choir moving down the main street. Doors rattled, dogs howled, and yet no figures were seen. The next morning, 3 households were found empty, beds made, dishes washed, cars parked neatly in driveways. The families had simply walked out into the night and never returned. Similar cases emerged in Canada, then Mexico, then across the Atlantic once more. Each incident bore the same signature: the hymn, the procession, the vanishing. Some survivors reported glimpsing shapes through their curtains, figures draped in shadow, faces turned upward as though in worship, moving in rhythm with the music. Scholars studying these accounts have noted a disturbing acceleration. Where once these events took decades apart, they now occur within years, sometimes within months. The procession is no longer content with scattered families. It seems to be gathering momentum, as though rehearsing for a final performance on a scale not yet imagined. And within survivor testimonies, a single phrase has begun to reappear, spoken with trembling certainty. Asterisk, they are not coming for the faithful anymore. They are coming for everyone. Asterisk, the procession has returned, and this time it no longer seeks permission to be heard. Though decades have passed since the night the Higgins family vanished, their name remains a cipher, a dark thread running through every retelling of the phenomenon. Scholars and folklorists often cite them as the modern anchor of the procession, the family whose disappearance reawakened the myth and tied it firmly to the 20th century. In England, where their farmhouse once stood, locals still avoid the grounds. The ruins of the Higgins property were long ago torn down, yet travelers claim that if you stand in the fields at dusk, the air carries a low hum, like the first note of a choir warming up. Farmers refuse to work the land, muttering that it is thin ground, a place where the border between worlds has worn away. But the Higgins legacy reaches beyond superstition. Their names surface in restricted documents, linked to both American and British intelligence. Files suggest that agents suspected the Higgins were deliberately chosen, a devout family trusted within their parish, whose disappearance could be studied as part of a larger pattern. Whether they were victims or participants remains unanswered. The family's belongings, stored in sealed crates after the investigation, raised further unease. Among them was a Bible with entire psalms underlined in trembling ink, especially passages speaking of new songs and multitudes gathered before the throne. A phonograph was also recovered, its needle resting on a record etched with nothing but a continuous, droning note. No manufacturer ever claimed it. The Higgins are remembered not only because they were taken, but because their absence reshaped the story. They became the symbol of what the procession could do, not just to isolated, forgotten families in rural America, but to anyone, anywhere, even in the heart of the modern world. Their silence endures as the loudest warning. The stories of the Higgins, the Whitakers, the Harpers, and countless others may appear scattered across centuries, mere fragments of folklore stitched together by fear. Yet when studied side by side, another possibility emerges, that they are not isolated events at all, but rehearsals. Rehearsals for something larger. The Forbidden Archive hints at it. A single phrase, repeated in different hands across decades. Asterisk, the great choir will not remain divided forever. Asterisk survivors, when pressed, often describe a similar vision. Processions from different times and places merging into one endless march, voices rising until they fill the sky itself. Researchers in the late 20th century began to see patterns in the dates. The vanishings clustered around moments of mass despair, economic collapses, epidemics, wars. It was as if the music drew strength from collective suffering, feeding on grief, pulling entire households into its orbit. If that trend holds, the modern world with its chaos, its crises, its endless unrest, offers more fuel than ever before. Whispers within theological circles speak of a final convergence, when the scattered processions will align, no longer content with taking families one by one. Instead, they will arrive as a multitude, a tidal wave of voices sweeping through towns, cities, nations. Not folklore, but apocalypse disguised as liturgy. Some speculate this has already begun. Reports of simultaneous choruses heard on different continents. Captured by satellites, dismissed as atmospheric interference. Recordings too perfect to be natural, yet too haunting to be dismissed. If the vanishings were chapters in a hidden history, then we are approaching the final act. The convergence is not an ending, but beginning, an unveiling of what has always been waiting, singing just beyond the veil of human hearing. The procession is gathering. Soon, its silence will be impossible to ignore. The story of the Higgins family is not merely a tale of one household swallowed by mystery. It is a doorway, a reminder that beneath the surface of recorded history lies another current, dark, unacknowledged, and relentless. Families did not simply vanish. They were taken by something that has shadowed humanity for centuries, wherein the massive faith of comfort, of salvation. We want to believe that institutions protect us, that churches, orphanages, and governments exist to shield the weak. But the Higgins story reveals a far more unsettling truth. Those very institutions knew and chose silence. They bartered secrecy for control. They let the songs move unchecked, allowed the processions to march, so long as the facade of order remained intact. The deeper terror is not in the vanishings themselves, but in the music. That ancient choir, always close, always waiting. Survivors whisper that once you hear it, you cannot forget it. The notes lodge in your marrow. They wait for the night when you are tired, when you are desperate, when you will mistake their call for hope. And then, like the Higgins, you will walk willingly into the dark. What happened in 1965 was not an ending. It was a reminder, a warning. For even now, in our digital world of endless noise, the voices are adapting. They are hidden in static, in corrupted files, in the faint hum of electricity. They are closer than ever. So, listen carefully the next time you hear a hymn with no source, a harmony with no choir. Close your windows. Block your ears. Do not follow. Because once the procession reaches your street, there will be no turning back. And you will understand too late why the Higgins family was never found.